If failing to plan is planning to fail, we should think about where to build our permanent factory and what form it should take. We've established a 5x5 radar grid with the exception of areas covered by water, revealing a reasonable and expanding amount of the surrounding terrain. The lakes to the east and north make it very problematic to build in those directions, a good example of why it's useful to look before you leap and not just add on to your jumpstart factory going wherever. Observe also that the map generation has been kind to us in clustering together some copper in the west and some iron in the southwest. They're a bit hard to make out at this distance, but it looks like the north has the best couple of oil deposits nearby as well. Putting these facts together, the only direction we can build in that isn't stumbling over something important is south. There are many ways to organize the factory, all of them having their own pros and cons. At some point, most new players will go through a phase of just haphazardly stamping down assemblers and belts and trying to reroute things through each other, and it looks kind of like this. Spaghetti! Chaos! There very much is an art to doing this intelligently and doing it well, but if you aren't very careful with a clearly defined plan, what's likely to happen is you just run out of room and you can't logistically get things where you need them to go without tearing up a whole bunch of your factory. Then you get frustrated and you feel like your brains are literally leaking out of every facial orifice. Gets bad enough, you might be desperate enough to go on some mad random search for some wannabe pretending he knows what to do in this game. One popular method is known as the city block approach. It's not always as complex as this, but the basic idea is dividing your factory into squares in a grid, with trains handling the transport of resources to and from each grid square. Each block only has the resources it needs to produce its product, and if you want to build something new, you make a new city block. A city block factory requires a moderate level of skill with trains, quite a bit of initial planning, and a lot of space. It's a lot more useful for an intermediate to advanced player who really wants to scale up a lot, especially going to a mega factory style, than it is for a new player learning the ropes. The method we're going to use is the much debated main bus, the main principle of which can be seen in our jumpstart factory. Look at the coal belt, which drops some off to copper, and then more to iron, and then more to steel, and then continues forward. That's the bus concept in a nutshell, an artery or highway that transports resources through the factory, distributing them where needed, and also accepting new resources into the bus. The bus can range widely in size from that single belt of coal we just saw to literally as big as you want it to be. To demonstrate, this is the main bus from the 1.1 save, and what makes it the main bus is simply that it's the primary flow of resources through the factory. There are a few key principles to keep in mind about the way I recommend using the main bus. The most important asset of this organizational structure is simply that it's very easy to expand and scale up your operation. Anytime you want a new production line, you simply add it along the side of the bus, divert whatever resources over there that it needs, and you've got a new product being made. It's simple to join the output right back up to the main bus if you need to. There are no concerns about further complexities of where to cram everything in and how to route everything where it needs to go. The bus handles that. It is bidirectional, which gives it flexibility. Observe the red circuits coming into the bus and then splitting off both directions. Most of the belts are heading upwards, but some of them heading downwards on the screen. This main bus is one-sided, meaning that we're only building new production lines on one side of it. The other side is left open in keeping with the principle of always leave space. If we ever need to add more volume or more products to the main bus, there is always room in the other direction to simply add more rows of belts. Finally, this main bus has a shoulder. The shoulder is a gap between the bus and the production lines, about 10 to 15 tiles I like to use. This allows for various pipe and transport belt logistics to happen, and you can also just move materials along the bus a shorter distance without bringing them all the way out into an empty lane on the bus itself, which can be useful in some cases. Once again, we're using the fundamental principles of leave space and be flexible. While the main bus is a venerable and traditional method of building your factory, it has been coming under increasing criticism as time has gone on. Some of the critiques are legitimate, one being that it's very expensive. You're building all these transport belts to go over a long distance, you've got this big buffer of products that you're not using just hanging out on the bus. It's also fairly time consuming to set up initially. But in my opinion, these flaws, especially for a new player, are simply not nearly as important as the assets we've mentioned. It's a case of perfect being the enemy of good. After you have more experience, it's very much a good thing to experiment with other ways of organizing the factory. But when you're learning, the main bus is a very effective and simple framework for avoiding thorny logistical issues. Returning then to the plan of where to build, we've labeled the map with amounts of all of our ore deposits, and we'll check in on our production to see how we're doing compared to the 10-hour rule. There's a little less than 20 hours of iron remaining, but still plenty for the time being. Notice the amounts in those copper and iron patches that we'll be expanding to. Those are going to hold us for quite a while. But where and what do we start with on our permanent factory? Well, start from the bottom up. Furnaces in a dedicated location, and we'll bring all of the ore mined to them. To add a tag to the map, simply select an icon, type in some text, and place it where you want it. Very simple. I'm using the thickest of the natural tree lines, both on the west and the north here, to guide where I place this. We don't want to have to chop through any more of them than is necessary. Again, don't skimp on space, and we can move this later if we want, but we'll start the main bus below this line of cliffs. There's some stone down here. We can fill in the small lake if we need to, but we're staying out of the way of any key ore deposits, and we can clear the enemies out later when it's time to build. So that's our basic plan. The furnace area should be plenty close to where we're going to get the ore to just send it over with belts, no problem at all for a while. We can pipe in oil from the north whenever that becomes necessary. We can set up train stations if we want to do that later in the area where we now have the jumpstart factory. The broad strokes are in place, and there should be more than enough space to work with. If you found this guide useful, please hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what specifically was useful to you, and we'll start getting those furnaces going next time.